Hi, my name's Susan, and today we're going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Earth Day by talking about pollinators. So let's get started. So before we talk about what pollinators do, let's talk about what pollination is. Pollination is the process that plants use to reproduce. So that's how they produce their seeds so they can make new plants. So we're going to look at this daylily here. See, yellow daylily. There's two main parts that are involved in pollination on the flower. One is the stamen, which are these long parts here with this on the end. And this thing on the end is called an anther, and that's where the pollen is. And if you look really close on this plant, you can actually see that yellow powder. That's the pollen. And then we also need the pistil, at the end of which is something called the stigma. That's really tiny on here. I don't know if you can see it. But the stigma is what needs to get pollen on it in order to reproduce, in order to create that seed and that fruit that the seed is in. So some plants can self-pollinate, but a lot of plants need help from pollinators to get the pollen from this plant over to the stigma of another plant. And that's how plants are going to reproduce. And to do that, they need pollinators. So now that we know what pollination is, we can talk about what pollinators are. When people think of pollinators, a lot of people think of bees, especially honeybees, and those are really important pollinators for the world. But pollinators are a whole bunch of different things. We have bees, we have butterflies, beetles like ladybugs are considered pollinators, ants, flies, some birds like the hummingbird, and in some parts of the world, even bats are pollinators, especially if they eat fruit. So when we're talking about pollinators, we're not just talking about bees, we're not even just talking about insects, we're talking about a huge variety of animals that help our plants reproduce and keep going. Here's a daylily, a really important plant for pollinators. So when pollinators are visiting plants, they probably don't even realize they're helping the plants out. What they're really looking for is food. They're eating the pollen, they're eating the nectar, which is typically at the bottom of the plant. And in the case of some pollinators, they're collecting that nectar and pollen to take back to their hives to feed other members of their colony. So when they stop at a plant, they're eating and they're collecting, and then they're getting some of that pollen on their bodies. And then when they fly or crawl to the next plant, without even realizing it, some of that pollen that's on them gets shaken off at this plant, and it helps pollinate it. So pollinators and the plants they live on are really dependent on each other to keep surviving. This butterfly is the tiger swallowtail butterfly, and you're very likely to see this one. This is a really common butterfly for our area. So definitely keep an eye out for these when you're looking at flowers and looking for different pollinators when you're out on a hike. So we have two bees here flying around, possibly a bumblebee and a honeybee, but they're both on a spiderwort flower. So here you can get a really good look at this bee and all the pollen it's collected. It has something on its legs called pollen baskets where it stores anything it collects from each flower. You can see this bee has been collecting a lot of pollen. So now that we know what pollination is and we know what pollinators are, why are pollinators important? A big reason is one we've already talked about. They help pollinate flowers and they help flowers reproduce. So if you look at all these flowers we have out here, I see some spiderwort, I see some fleabane, some black-eyed Susan, some daisies. These were all created because pollinators took pollen from one flower to the stigma of another flower and they helped it reproduce. So without pollinators, we wouldn't have this beautiful landscape to look at. Another big reason pollinators are important is because they're part of the entire ecosystem. An ecosystem is all the things that live in one place, all the plants and animals that live together in one place. So pollinators don't just help flowers reproduce, they also provide food for other animals in that ecosystem. Birds, other insects, frogs like we talked about earlier. Pollinators, especially the insects, are really important to keeping the whole ecosystem thriving and healthy. And then a third reason pollinators are really important, especially to us humans, is because they produce a ton of our food. A lot of our agriculture, a lot of our crops are dependent upon pollinators to reproduce, just like flowers are. So any fruit you eat, vegetables, a lot of nuts like almonds, all kinds of crops are able to reproduce and able to be created and able to be eaten by us because pollinators helped them reproduce. It's estimated that 1 out of every 3 bites of food you take at a meal is the result of a pollinator helping pollinate that plant that it came from. So if we want to keep eating, we need our pollinators to be healthy so that they can keep producing food for us. Here we have another pollinator. This is a hoverfly, even though it looks kind of like a bee, but you can see it's eating the pollen off the anthers of the spiderwort flower. Here's an example of a plant that was successfully pollinated. This is a raspberry vine. As you can see, there's a fruit on here. It's starting to turn red. It's not quite ripe yet. But earlier in the spring, these had white flowers. A pollinator came along, possibly a bee, and stopped at one flower, had pollen on its body, went to another flower, pollinated it, and now it's successfully created fruit, which has seeds in it. So now an animal is going to eat this, or it's going to fall on the ground, and it's going to start a whole new raspberry plant. So now we know why our pollinators are so important, but our pollinators are in trouble. Their populations are declining really, really fast all over the world. One of them, the rusty patch bumblebee, is already listed as a federally endangered species, and another one, the monarch butterfly, is being considered for listing because of how quickly its population is declining. So what's hurting these pollinators? A big one is habitat loss. Habitat loss due to development, due to invasive species, those plants and animals that don't belong in an ecosystem that kind of invade it, and also due to climate change. Climate change is causing a huge amount of habitat loss all over the world. Also, pesticides. We use a lot of pesticides to keep the bugs that harm us away, but those same pesticides can hurt our pollinators as well. Another one is pollution. The same thing that's hurting the rest of the things in the environment. Not keeping our environment clean is having a negative effect on our pollinator populations. And then finally, different parasites and diseases are having a huge impact on our pollinators. Not just on them, but on the plants they need as well. So I'm standing among a bunch of common milkweed. And this plant is important because this is the only plant that monarch butterflies will lay their eggs on. It's the only plant monarch caterpillars will eat. So there's parasites that can get on these plants and damage them, and that means there's less habitat for those monarchs to use when they need to lay their eggs. So all these things are hurting our pollinator populations a lot all over the world. So there are a lot of things that are hurting pollinators, but the good news is that there are a lot of things you can do right at home to help out pollinators. A big one is to plant native plants. These are the plants that are supposed to be in an ecosystem. They've lived there a long time. There's a lot of animals and other plants that depend on them. So when you're planting new plants in your yard, just make sure you're planting the native plants of the area you live in. So this sign back here, you can see it says Monarch Way Station. That indicates a site that has planted a lot of native plants that help monarch butterflies. But these plants don't just help monarch butterflies, they can help all our pollinators in the area. So if you go to monarchwatch.org, you can learn more about this specific project if you want to try to start a monarch way station, but also just looking up the plants that are supposed to be growing in your area that can help monarch butterflies, that can help bees. This is a great way to help pollinators right from your own backyard. Another way you can help pollinators is by just keeping track of the ones you see. There are a lot of citizen science projects that allow you to take photos of the pollinators you see on flowers and on plants and send them into a program. And this helps scientists keep track of pollinators all over the world. So they can see what's living where. They can see if there's not a lot of pollinators they see appearing in a certain area where they're supposed to be. And you can just help them monitor the populations of those pollinators. And then the final way you can help pollinators is by just sharing this information that you're learning today. Telling your friends about pollinators, telling your family about how important they are and ways they can help them. Because the more people that know about pollinators, the more people that know how important they are, and the more people that know ways to help them, then the better chance our pollinators have of having their populations recover and have them helping produce flowers and plants for years to come. A great way to help bees is through a citizen science project. I'm going to show you one today, but there's a few others you can find and participate in if you want. This one is called the World Bee Count. It's put together by a few different organizations from all over the world that are trying to help bees and pollinators in general. So all you do is you download the app and then you just start submitting photographs of pollinators that you see in your area. And this is going to get added to data from all over the world. So you are helping keep track of pollinators and their populations from all kinds of different countries. So the scientists that receive this data then look at the pollinators. They can identify them. You don't have to identify them yourself if you don't know how or you're not sure what it is. They're just going to keep track of what pollinators are in what places. And also see if there's an absence of pollinators. If they're not seeing a bug from a country where it's supposed to be, that's going to give them an idea that that population might be in trouble. And you can go to the map and you can just see how many people from all over the world are participating in this. And you can see their photographs. So this is a great way to help bees and all kinds of pollinators right from your backyard. So we are back here at the Westchester Migratory Bird Sanctuary, and there aren't just birds for you to see here. They also have a really extensive butterfly garden. So this is a great place to see if you can spot some pollinators. So we're going to walk around for a little bit and see if we can find any. Another good way to help butterflies that I forgot to mention before is a butterfly house. This actually provides some more shelter for butterflies in your area. So another easy way you can help butterflies right in your own backyard. I want to point out this is the purple coneflower or echinacea, and it's a great plant for pollinators because it produces a ton of nectar, and it's a native plant, so it's really good for just the whole ecosystem. So on this common milkweed plant, we have a couple different bugs. We have the red milkweed beetle up here, he's crawling down that leaf, and then down here we have the swamp milkweed leaf beetle. So neither of these beetles are considered pollinators. What they do is they actually eat the leaves of this milkweed plant, but if you have your eye out for pollinators, you might see these guys as well. So now you know what you're looking at. You can identify them. There he is crawling back up the leaf. Here is a white cabbage butterfly on a spiked speedwell plant. This is a large milkweed bug. Again, not a pollinator, but you are going to see this when you're out looking for other pollinators. And it's on a butterfly weed, which is another type of milkweed and another great native plant to plant for pollinators. Here's another great flower for pollinators. This is called the blanket flower. So lots of milkweeds you can plant, lots of coneflowers, and you can also plant these. Lots of pollinators really like this flower. So remember, when you're on a hike, always keep an eye out for other stuff too. You can see stuff like this tiny frog or toad, probably a toad based on where we're seeing it. He's less than an inch long. Here's an example of one of those things that's hurting our pollinator population I mentioned earlier. This is a pest called an aphid, and it will infest milkweed plants and eat the leaves, which means there's going to be less places for monarchs to lay their eggs and just less plants overall that pollinators need to survive. So here is a monarch butterfly. So like I said, their populations are declining, so really exciting that we get to see one. You can see it's not on a milkweed plant right now, but milkweed is what they lay their eggs on. It's the one their caterpillars need, but they can actually eat from a few different flowers and plants. So really exciting to get to see one of these. So now you know what pollinators are, what they do, why they're important, and some ways you can help them. So I hope you go share this information with your friends and family so they can also learn how important pollinators are, not just to us, but to the whole ecosystem that we live in. And I hope you guys learned a lot, and I hope you had fun. Thanks for joining me.